those seem to be immutable. You can't go around fooling around or trying to change them, allegedly. So
What?
they're described as being from time immemorial.
Question.
Yes.
This is the new guy on the Masonic Roundtable. So why do different jurisdictions have different numbers of landmarks then if they're immutable?
It's just like if you look at the Gospels, it's the same explanation.
Yes.
It's like how come you have 4 different Gospels with different storylines and
But they're
different...
synoptic.
That was way too profound. That was way too much for me. Sorry, man. Sorry.
It's the same but different.
Indeed. Yeah, I found it interesting that a lot of them you have to, I'm a Mason in quite a few jurisdictions, and I pulled the constitutions or the grand constitutions or the methodical digest from each one, and they all kind of have the same basic tone or tenor to them, and they all essentially look like what you find in Mackey's Masonic Jurisprudence, right? You've got some put the landmarks in, right? So the landmarks are in their grand constitutions. Some are not. Virginia actually doesn't have the landmarks in our methodical digest, which is our grand constitution, but it's on our website, which is interesting.
Right.
Yes. So it's a footnote on the website, but it's not in the actual constitution.
Actually codified.
Laws.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then if you look at anybody that based their stuff off of Mackey's, South Carolina is a notable exception because Mackey basically wrote their constitutions, and but they all talk about the same basic things, where it talks about why there is masonry, concerning God and religion and things and all of those things. Then it gets into the ancient charges, taking a lot of things from Anderson and Desaguliers and things like that. It looks very similar to Anderson's constitutions of the 1720s. And then it talks about the structure of the Grand Lodge, which is, super fun reading. If you haven't dipped your toe in that, I mean, it's really interesting. You get about 100 pages of what the Grand Lodge is supposed to do. And then you get another 100 pages of what individual lodges are supposed to do. And then finally, you get something about what the actual Mason is supposed to do, which in most of the ones that I saw, that's usually the smallest part of the Constitution, is concerning the actual Mason themselves. Right. But there's a lot on the Grand Lodge and what the individual lodges are supposed to do.
Now, I mean, one thing that's consistent, what I like about all these, because it's fun that every jurisdiction does it a little bit differently, but yet there is some universality to that. That's why when you look at, we just did some episodes recently on the old charges, right? That a lot of the, if not the wording, the structure of the old charges still carries through in 2021. I mean, it's fascinating because it outlines the structure of how to govern as a Masonic organization, both operative and now speculative. And so what that means that while you will see the different wording, you'll see different processes, basically a lot of the content is still the same, right? How a Grand Lodge should govern, how it's structured. The only things you're going to see different are things like we're going to have different committees than a different state, for example, or how they handle Masonic trials, like process things, right? Things that have unique steps. That's going to evolve as society evolves, but the kind of the structure, the authorities, the roles that are in the Grand Lodge, those are pretty much the same across all jurisdictions. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it evolves across time and space, because you'll have the change of the culture, but you have also the regional differences. So I'm pretty sure that the differences you find in the process and the Masonic jurisprudence steps in Florida, there's going to be some differences compared to California, because of the difference in not just time, but the local flavor.
Right. So moving from kind of the similarities, let's go down a level. So each jurisdiction will follow It really helps if you're familiar with like how laws are set up in the federal versus the state level here in the states, right? Where you have the Constitution, which applies federally to everybody, and then you have more local laws. And so, such is true for each Grand Lodge having their own laws that apply to everybody, and then lodges can have their own bylaws that, as long as they don't, supersede the Grand Lodge, they can set up, more discrete types of laws as well. What's interesting, if you're a new Mason or if you travel in another jurisdiction, that Constitution level document could be different. As Joe said, here in Virginia, we call that the Methodical Digest. That is the go-to law book for how things are governed in Virginia Masonic jurisdictions. But in other areas, they have different terms. Like I know, Joe, you said that what do we got in Massachusetts? What do they call them?
The Grand Constitutions.
Right. So it's Grand Constitution, not the Methodical Digest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you have even in areas like Pennsylvania. Such a weird thing. When I first heard that, I was like, "What did you just say?" No, they said that their book of law is called the Ahiman Raison, which is actually relates to an old 1751 document by the same name, which actually was said to be some Hebrew. So the title Ahiman Raison has been said to be the Hebrew language, variously meaning to help a brother, or the will of selected brethren, or the royal builders. All wrong. We think that Lawrence Dermott added that in that title of this constitutional book, based off of two biblical figures, Ahiman and Raison. One, because this was assembled after the ancients and moderns kind of split, and so Ahiman represented the ancients and Raison represented the moderns. But there's a little bit of useless trivia as far as jurisprudence goes. But now back to our regularly scheduled program.
I wanted to kind of like bounce off of you the comparison of the federal law versus state law. And when comparing the bylaws are the responsibility of the local lodges, right? And that's what documents the dues, that documents the process of voting for a candidate, accepting petitions, all of that. But the bylaws are subject to an authorization or revision approval by the Grand Lodge. So it's not like you can come up with whatever you want down there.
Exactly.
You got to send them up to the Grand Lodge in order for them to check them, make sure it's kosher. Right. Then it goes back with their blessing, and then you can pass them. So, which is it's a different, slightly different process. I'm not correcting you, John. Of course.
So the analogy is like, imagine if each state's constitution had to be approved by Congress before the state could operate. Right? That's
there would be no laws.
It would be lawless.
It'd be like Florida.
It would be terrible, just like here.
But you say that, and I've seen, because I've worked on specific lodge bylaws, and you really can't go too crazy with them for that exact reason.
I mean, it really depends too. I mean, you've been in if you're referring to like Virginia bylaws, there is Virginia bylaws for those who aren't Masons in Virginia, there is a very prescribed set of things you can put in your bylaws. Here's the date we meet. Here's the address that we meet. We meet on this day. Here are our dues. This is what we pay our Tyler. There's only like 7 or 8 things on there that you can actually have as part of your bylaws, and to actually add things onto them as addendums is quite the rigmarole.
Well, and that's what I'm referring to. Absolutely.
Well, I was going to say it's converse. So I was raised a Master Mason in Maryland, and when I became a Master Mason, I got a book with my lodge's bylaws. It was like a book. It had like 20, 25 pages in it with all the different bylaws for the lodge, and then I'm comparing the two. I'm like, wow, this is a big difference. Like to Juan's point, these are the things that the lodge does, and this is the manner in which we elect candidates and all this stuff. So it's basically a book that has useful information for you to know how your lodge operates and stuff. So I think there's a myriad of different bylaws across the world in terms of how people do masonry at the local level.
Yeah, I mean, the example that I'm thinking of comes right to mind when we tried to do the Patriot Lodge's bylaws. We were unique in that we were emulating the university scheme from England and what Boston University Lodge did and Harvard Lodge has done by restricting membership to students, faculty, staff, and alumni of the affiliated university. And so, because it was so different than most other lodges' bylaws, that certainly took a lot of coordination, collaboration, and a little bit of back scratching to get that approved. But it did; it passed, and so that really transitioned us into really what like the next section is like how do laws either at the lodge level or at the jurisdiction level, the state level. How does that happen? How do you get a new law added in? So what would the process be?
Well, I can tell you about my.
Sorry.
I see you. I hear you. I could tell you about my interesting process learning about that firsthand.
Firsthand
Experience, yeah. So I won't name the jurisdiction because I'm a member of a bajillion, but I saw that there was a law that was kind of vague and needed to be changed, and so I submitted a resolution or a resolution to get voted on, and the Constitution book, I won't name it, gives you a very specific outline with how laws need to get presented and how they need to get voted on. So that was great. It gave you a really step-by-step process. You need to draft it, and you need to draft it with, here's the old law, and you need to add your changes or omissions or subtractions, leaving in the word that Juan wanted to use, the strike through.
Thank you.
So you leave your strike. You're welcome. You leave your strike throughs in, and you basically present a resolution with the changes incorporated into the original law. And then you submit it to the Grand Lodge. In this case, it was almost 12 months before the next Grand Lodge met. So almost a year out, you had to present them, and they needed to sit basically for a year and go through the Jurisprudence Committee, and then get approved to go to the floor. And the first time I presented it, because I did it twice, the first time I presented it, it was kicked back to me and was told that you have to be a member of the Grand Lodge in order to submit a resolution.
So how would you have known that? That's the first question is that written down anywhere?
It is not written down anywhere. Yeah. So I did my research and I looked in the Book of Constitutions using a generic term. Mm-hmm. And then I saw that in one part of the book, it said members of the Grand Lodge. I did not look in the Ahimon Raisin. One part of the law book said members of the Grand Lodge are past masters and all the Grand Lodge officers and past Grand Masters, all the purple people. And, to include past masters. And, and then there was another part that said members of the Grand Lodge are the stationed officers of the lodge. So at the time I was the junior warden. So I was like, ooh, I'm a stationed officer. I can write a resolution. I was told that I couldn't because there were no past masters on it and I wasn't a past master. So, so instead of, just crumpling it up and throwing it away. So
where was that written down? Did you know that?
That wasn't there. That was one of Mackey's, what he calls the unwritten laws that he writes about, but they're in the unwritten laws section.
He writes about the unwritten. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, section 2 of the Ahimon Raisin. And so, yeah, long story short, so I went and campaigned a little bit. I got 40 past masters to sign it for me. And then I resubmitted it. And so it will be on the floor of somebody's Grand Lodge this November. So it was a learning process, and it was fun.
You didn't need 40, did you?
No,
Okay,
I needed
that's
one, but
Actually, you needed 41. Sorry, you
I just need.
just missed the cutoff.
I went
So
for
if you could
extra
just go
stat.
ahead and
So
resubmit that
yeah,
next year, that'd be great.
no, no, you just need one. But I got the extra 39 just for gravitas, shall we say?
Oh, man.
and just to help people visualize how this looks, you'll have the document, and at the bottom you'll see the roster of all the people who are supporting it. And once it actually makes it up to Grand Lodge and it gets reviewed and it's found kosher to be brought to the floor during the Grand Lodge sessions, the jurisprudence committee of the Grand Lodge will actually recommend or not recommend um, adoption, or yeah, adoption is the word of the resolution. So whenever the members of the lodge, whenever the actual brothers get to see the proposed legislation, it has it has a lot of information that kind of helps you or guides you into making a decision. You see who proposed it, you can see who supports it, you can see if it's recommended for adoption by the jurisprudence committee. So by just those 3 points, you're able to glean a lot of information. Um, and of course, you have to be very involved to know. Well, if you see like these are the people that actually are supporting it, and you know them not to be, uh, let's say, not have a good track record for making good decisions for the good of the order or the good of the lodge, then that may be a good sign for you to start asking questions and start uh, or even bring it up into discussion whenever it's presented into Grand Lodge. And I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but um,
Right,
there's a
but then
process to it.
yeah, and that's it. So the good news is that in general, minus a couple of unwritten rules, that is written down that process of how does one submit. Like here in Virginia, you have to. We usually have our grand annual communication sometime in early November, and they want you to have any new resolutions. You know, that's the new laws. They want a resolution introduced and signed and conform to all those different specifications by December 31st of that year, because they actually have to do a whole bunch of work behind the scenes to snail mail it out to all the lodges over the next year before September of the following year, so then everyone gets a chance to see it before it's actually voted on in the following November. So, you know, you better have all your I's dotted and T's crossed almost a year before you submit it, or before you hope it to pass. I'll put it that way, because then the fun begins. Just like, you know, Congress here in the United States, the law just doesn't write itself. Like there's a lot of conversation that has to go on, explaining behind the scenes, getting support. Because while you can, some laws should be black and white of like, here's the justification of why we need this. You know, nothing in life is ever that easy. You really need to explain the purpose of why we need something to change, because change is a 4-letter word in Freemasonry. So it helps if you smooth things over with the brethren who might be concerned, might not understand, might need further explanation. And I've seen that work very successfully. If you are really good at you know, socializing and communicating these ideas, and if you have the bandwidth to go travel around really across the whole state, because remember, these are state run jurisdictions, then like if you have the bandwidth, by all means, like go and travel around and answer questions, and that will certainly help that resolution from getting to get passed. But
Yeah.
you know,
Especially since you can't, just like you mentioned, like it's not always black and white, like why the there is a proposed legislation. And you may try to explain, and for the brothers listening, you may, you know, some of you may think like, why is it so difficult? You can just explain it. I'll tell you this. Have you ever been texting with someone and halfway through it, you're like, you know what? Can I just call you?
It would just be
Right?
easier if I just called you.
It's exactly the same thing. There's just so many nuances to the explanation and the conversation. And when you look at the proposed legislation, or you look at the actual digest, for example, you'll see very legalese sounding stuff, like whereas the lodges have their own authority to make decisions upon blah 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 blah, let it be hereforth known that blah 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 blah, and it's not very clear. And sometimes you need to ask those questions about, like, what motivated these brothers to actually take the amount of time that they took to write the proposed legislation, to actually do the legwork, to take it and get the signatures. Like, what's happening? And a lot of these legislations, you can think of the benefits that one is entitled to as a Master Mason. You're entitled to a Masonic funeral. Well, that's easier said than done. If you're a Mason, you are a Mason upon being brought from darkness to light. If you know what that means, you know what that means. That's the moment in which you are now a Mason. Are you now entitled to have a Masonic funeral? Well, it's it's always it's a discussion that's ongoing. Mm-hmm. And what motivates an organization? Boom. It's always a conversation that you would say, okay, well, like, what happens if you initiate? This is your brother, and he died a month after being initiated. Could a lodge actually do a Masonic funeral and give them all those benefits? So those are difficult discussions to have.
Which I also find fascinating too, because if you look into your state's constitutions, you'll also see like subtext, below these laws, where you see where there was a gray area in the law. It'll say, hey, in 1929, Grandmaster so-and-so approved entered apprentices for having a Masonic funeral. And that way it clarifies the law, and then either it was like a one-time edict, or that has now been voted on and approved as law as well. So let's transition to now. Okay, so we've written the proposed change to the Grand Lodge laws, and we submit it on time in the format they want. All the I's dotted, T's crossed, past masters added, blessings from the Pope, and now we're good to go. It's all set, right? It just goes right to the floor and we get voted on it, right? Not quite in Virginia, at least, because we have a committee that is a standing committee as defined by our Methodical Digest, a committee on jurisprudence. So that is a committee of 9 individuals that are selected by the Grandmaster, and they actually will look at the law. It has to pass that committee first. So they get first cut of sending it back, of rejecting it, or making modifications to it, right? So that is their job, to be the quote-unquote Grand Lodge lawyers, to make sure that everything is written correctly and doesn't break any other parts of the law or anything like that. Some do it better than others, but that is often a committee that a Grand Lodge will have in order to just make sure the quality is there as it goes through. Right?
You said 9 members?
I believe in Virginia it's 9 members.
Yeah, in Florida is comprised of no less than 3 and no more than 11. Oh, no, never mind. That's for the regular committees. But the Committee for Masonic Jurisprudence shall have such number of members as may be determined by the Grandmaster.
Nice loose language. Love it.
Yeah.
Could that mean 1?
Come in!
None.
Very good question.
1?
Yeah.
Ooh. Lots of legal loopholes there.
Yeah.
So then, normally the process would be, if you manage to survive, to write it correctly, to get good counsel, to make sure you're not really upsetting anyone, and you get your resolution, proposed resolution, past the Committee on Jurisprudence, then it comes up for the vote. And that usually happens at the Grand Annual Communications, where, again, your Grand Lodge will meet once a year to do business. This is part of said business, where they bring in and introduce new resolutions. They discuss them, and there's a whole process and procedure, different in every jurisdiction, but there is a process of, when to bring things up, how long the speaker has to speak, who can speak for, who can speak against, and then boom, not only a vote, but how votes are to be done, whether to be voice
Exactly.
vote, one vote per lodge, one vote per past master. It's all different, but the important takeaway there is that each jurisdiction has a process of how to vote upon said resolutions. So that's,
Just to be
that's
clear,
fun.
when the proposed legislation checks on the jurisprudence committee, do they send it back to lodges for them to keep it in mind? Because like lodges,
So here in Virginia, I'm not sure how it works in other places, but here in Virginia, you get a packet, or each lodge gets a packet of all the things that are resolutions, proposed resolutions, because I know some jurisdictions have each stationed officer has a vote. Some jurisdictions is just the master has a vote, or the three of them collectively have one vote. But at least in Virginia, and I've seen it similar in other places, I think it's around September, October, when you get that packet of here's all the things they're going to vote on at Grand Lodge. And you're supposed to, I don't know if it gets done everywhere, you're supposed to discuss it. And basically the lodge is supposed to vote on how the master is bringing his vote, right? Because his is a vote of the lodge, not his own autocratic vote. So it should be talked about and it should be discussed, and the lodge should be able to discuss and tell the master what their wishes are for that vote.
It's a lot of shoulds.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean that's
yes.
how it is. That's how it is over here. But the point is, like, there's the last line of the document explains the jurisprudence position. It would say whether they recommend or not. So I think that's a very telling line. The problem is, like, you have no visibility as to why they don't recommend something. And when you read the proposed legislation, you may be like, oh my God, this makes absolute sense. We should do this. And then you read the verbiage that says that the jurisprudence committee doesn't necessarily support it. There's no explanation. How come? How come they don't want it?
Yeah, it can die on
Does
the
it?
floor very quickly, or
Yeah.
die in any step in the process. So that's fun, especially again if you have to wait a whole other year to reintroduce it with said changes. It's not very flexible, but of course there's an argument for that as well, right? You don't want the laws changing every year for just a variety of reasons. You want it to be a little bit more thought through and stable, but I could argue against that too. I'm trying to find the positive in such a slow process, but that's not how I work.
But John, new guy question: can't the laws just change automatically if you have grandmasters that just issue edicts for their term?
Ah, that's right. We did use the E word and didn't even go into that.
Yeah.
Because, boy, it's good to be king, right? Where a grandmaster, a sitting grandmaster, in most jurisdictions, has the full authority to just introduce an edict, basically a statement of fact, a fiat, that says, this is what I'm going to do about this situation, and it remains law during his tenure. So what that means is that until that Grand Master has either rescinded that change or has been his successor has been elected and installed, then really it's law, and you really can't challenge it because that's something that's unique. Guess you could kind of compare it to an executive order here in the United States. Um,
Yeah.
so that's another analogous comparison. But yeah, most obviously it's a power that is given to a Grand Master and shouldn't be taken lightly. I have watched some farewell addresses of some Grand Masters that have done it for amazing reasons. The one I'm thinking about right now is there was a dying brother who was a fellow craft, and his terminal disease, and he really wanted to get his Master Mason degree, but he was bedridden in the hospital, and so the Grand Master, by edict, said we can get rid of all these time requirements and proficiency requirements, and we can do the Master Mason degree in his hospital room as long as we tile it appropriately. And they did that for that brother, and got him to the degree of Master Mason in an altered format. And that was a beautiful thing to do.
Wow.
As Grand Master, to use that power given to him by the state constitution.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned the jurisprudence, when you mentioned the executive edicts and that sort of stuff, and you talk about the successor of the Grand Master. So you have in Florida, you have a deputy Grand Master who is just waiting on the sidelines to be the Grand Master. Before he is voted in to be the Grand Master, he has to meet with the Jurisprudence Committee and present his plan for his year in order for them to corroborate whether his plans are in line with what's acceptable for the craft. They would advise whether things need to be, or expectations need to be adjusted due to prior legislations or things that are already in the books that may conflict with what the person plans. But I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a good check on the powers in order to keep that sanctity of the institution. It's not just like he has full blown power and he can do absolutely anything he wants. There is some sort of pressure valve there to
a little bit of checks and balances.
Mitigate. Yeah, enough. Yeah,
just a little. I mean, so that's interesting too, because as benevolent as an edict might be, it does expire, and so that's time where if the Grand Master moves on, then what happens to that edict, right? If it could be something that everybody wants, but if that Grand Master's out, it is no longer Masonic law, and therefore has to go through a similar process all over again to make sure that it's it is something that's officially in the books and has gone through the process. So, which of course can be time consuming, but hey, if it's worth doing, twice, it's worth doing bad.
That kind of goes back to one thing that we've talked about before, is that we have that in my year syndrome, and it happens to it happens to masters and it happens to Grand Masters. I'm an advocate for there to be some sort of a consensus or a group effort into moving the lodge or the fraternity in a specific direction. So it doesn't come as a surprise to someone that they're going to be Grand Master in 3 years. Like they've seen the writing on the wall for a while. You're not supposed to talk. Yeah, you're not supposed to talk about the future yet.
Sorry. Yeah, right. That will never happen. But no, but you bring up an excellent point. There are some jurisdictions that do vision cast 3 to 5 to 7 years out. You know what I mean? So it's not just somebody moving up through the chairs. And you start to see that in jurisdictions that actually have a path forward and it stays that path forward persists year over year, and it's an awesome thing, when you see them vision cast that far out, and all the Grand Line officers are kind of in sync with what this big collective vision is, and they move forward with that, because then you don't see these wide shifts, and you don't see edicts getting turned over year after year, things like that. You brought up something, John, that I know we've seen in Virginia, where you have something it's like an edict, but it's called a standing resolution. So a Grand
Right.
Master will make a standing resolution, which is basically, hey, this is an edict essentially that basically stays up through my term, but it's really a resolution, right? It's a change to the law. And if that standing resolution, there's been certain ones that show up January 1st of every year, or when the new Grand Line gets put in, you like first thing they do is make this a standing resolution again. And I can think of one offhand. It's the Pledge of Allegiance. That was I know in Virginia that was not one that
Yes.
was in the law book, but every year for years and years, the Grand Master first resolution they would make is, Pledge of Allegiance right after you open a lodge. And then after, I don't know how many years it was, but after several years, it was like, well, guys, why don't we make this part of the law and stop making resolutions year after year? So to John's point, it went through that really laborious process, but probably had its wheels greased a little bit because everybody wanted to do it. But that's another example of things that a Grand Master can do during his year that can later become laws for into perpetuity. So
And let me just preface this to say that probably the reason we haven't done a jurisprudence episode for until 351 episodes is that this is like the least favorite part of Masonry for me. I am so glad that there are brothers who are willing to comb through the bureaucracy and the legislation and go through all of the all of the, I don't even know what's the word, just the effort.
minutia,
Yeah, just to make these
minutia.
things happen, um, because it is the least amount of masonry to me, right? But I'm glad it's there because a lot, Gordon, as we said in the beginning, these the concept of guiding documents and structure has been there since before modern specular Freemasonry, right? Since the old charges. So obviously there's a need to, back then to protect the guild system, and now to make sure that we don't implode on ourselves, that we do have some checks and balances. So thank you to all of you guys and brothers who are actually doing that work today, who are on those committees, who love nerding out over legislative text. I'll drink to that because that is
Salud.
salute.
Salud.
That is not something that I have any interest in whatsoever. But thank you for doing it.
There's some parallels there with business. Uh, when you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, there's an excitement to the idea generation, inventing something, strategizing about things. And it's not always fun to deal with the filing for filing the documents to become a
Right.
corporation, or having to
Patent and Trade
draft.
Office or trademarks or
Exactly.
legal
Especially like
fees,
contracts. You talk
taxes.
about it's like, oh, can we just shake hands and just move forward? Nah, dude, get yourself a contract just to make sure that everybody knows what to expect from the transaction or from the partnership. And you do it for the health of the business. And in this case, the jurisprudence uh, checks and balances, all of this liturgical process is there in a sense for the protection of the craft. Just like with the Constitution, you don't want a constitutional amendment every single time. You want to make sure that, okay, do we really have to amend the Constitution? And if so, can we do it in a way that is not going
All
to
right.
give us problems?
So let's pull that thread because
Do it.
okay, we have, that's the beauty of, the statehood in the United States is that each state can make their own speed limit laws. They can make different, substance laws, etc. Right? So we can think of all like the popular issues of the time that each state has some control over. Wouldn't it be fascinating to run that Masonic experiment where each jurisdiction could have a little bit more flexibility and less tradition, more flexibility, because this is just administrative, right? This isn't, you know, secret sign scripts words, or this is process. So wouldn't it be cool to have one Grand Lodge that was like, you know what? Let's hit the big old reset button on our Constitution, start from scratch, and let the flexibility go where we can pivot on a dime if the fraternity needs to, and not be stuck with bureaucracy that has evolved and grown and you know got barnacles on it and scales from you know centuries of just being you know drugged through the mud. So I don't know. It would be fun to think about what that would look like as a fast moving Grand Lodge that had a streamlined process to think of it like TurboTax for masonry, right?
All I have in my head, man, is just the generational divide of one side of the room cheering and the other side of the room just spontaneously combusting. You know, they're like,
That's
no!
why I'm laughing.
Like scanners,
That's
man. The heads popping. You know,
That's exactly
like, no,
why I'm laughing, because
no
I
chance.
imagined, and I can't use the expression live. I'll tell you guys in the green room. And maybe I'll tell the Knights and Squires. Those are the people who support us on Patreon and have access to our secret Facebook group. But there's an expression my father uses that is perfect for the reaction I saw in my mind of some people to you having the audacity to use TurboTax in the same sentence.
Real world example. COVID. Boom. Right? There's structure about how often lodges to meet, when they're supposed to meet, how the bylaws say where they're specified to meet. Wouldn't it be awesome if there were a streamlined process that could, without Grandmaster edict, right, to just come in and say, hey, you know what, we need to change the way we operate on a dime for the sake of the fraternity, right? Yeah. And when COVID's over, we can change right back, right? That we can collectively vote on these things in a much more streamlined process so that we can operate digitally, virtually, with all the checks and balances built therein. I mean, we didn't see any Grand Lodge completely cut over to virtual meetings, right? I mean, we saw a lot more of the social hours happen through Zoom. We saw correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, because
I mean there were some jurisdictions that had virtual Grand Lodge sessions.
Yes.
There were jurisdictions that were balloting on candidates virtually. So there were drips and drabs, but
right.
You know, to your
could
point,
you imagine how much faster that transformation could have been for all the right reasons, and of course I'm not saying no process, but I'm saying, you know, what would that look like if jurisprudence moved at the pace of, I don't know, email instead of the the Pony Express.
I hate to tell you this, my friend, but having worked in the legal industry for almost 20 years, that is literally the largest oxymoron on earth.
I can see the pain on your face.
The legal process moving quickly. I mean, it's built to not move quickly, and I'm not just poo-pooing on, you know, Grand Lodges and stuff like that.
Is what it is, right?
The jurisprudence process is a process, and it's called a process for a reason. I think the cop-out answer is that's why you have the Grand Master has the power to issue edicts and change the law during his time for that finite period of time, you know. And but to your point, you know, some jurisdictions, that was awesome. You know, they had their Grand Lodge sessions online. It was cool. You could log in and see things happen because, you know, no grand jurisdiction has, you know, tens of thousands of their members attending their Grand Lodge sessions, right? It's usually a couple of hundred people, you know.
Wait, what?
Unless,
I thought this was like the event of the year.
Nah, well, you know, you can buy lapel pins and ties.
Oh, that's true.
Like that. You get lovely swag holders like the Winding Stairs. They're amazing. Great guy. I don't know who runs it. But it's usually lacking in attendance. You know what I mean? And I mean, I think that came up on a question on Kansas Freemasonry, which I thought was a really interesting question, which was, if you're not an officer or already a past master, do you still attend Grand Lodge? And the answers were kind of interesting. Like if you're not in line, like expected to be there, or you've already been through the chairs, do you still attend Grand Lodge? And the overwhelming answer was no.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm surprised about the answer. Like, I'm interested in it. Um, I've missed it most of the time that I've been a Master Mason, but I am very interested in it. I'm very interested in the process. I really enjoy, without revealing too much, the whole process of voting and discussion. That to me is very interesting. It reveals a lot about the spirit of the law in discussion. So that's very interesting. I think every Master Mason should do it at least once, even if they don't have it, if they don't intend to be in leadership. They should do it at least once. But before we get too far from what we were talking about earlier, John, I can see the appeal of that conceptual, nimble method of self-government. I see the appeal because you and I, and I'm sure Joe too, like we're very attuned to like modern business and startups, and they have that flexibility to
Right.
pivot on a moment's notice in response to the real needs of the consumer.
Very agile.
Yeah,
Agile,
well,
exactly.
yeah, and let me build on that too. Right, from a government perspective, that you do have the concept of like even like you have statism and anarchy, right, as wings of the role of government, right? So this is what we're talking about here: the role of Grand Lodge. Do you have the statism level of everything is bureaucratic and you have to ask, Grandmaster may I for everything, or do you have anarchy where every lodge gets to do whatever they want and to heck with a Grand Lodge, and right, what's that spectrum in between? While I'm not advocating for Masonic anarchy, though that would be a fun episode, that I am saying that that's the way we used to be. Right, we had lodges that operated on their own pre-Grand Lodge days back, 1700s. Of course, I'm talking about that time frame.
Yeah.
And the amount of recognition, the amount of structure, right? I mean, even if you've ever heard Jason Richards do his Scottish Freemasonry presentation, which you should, basically when the Grand Lodge of Scotland tried to organize and pull all of the operative guilds under their wing, the guilds were like, "You can't tell us what to do. We're older than you. Like, go away. Like, if you want us to like play nice, we'll play nice. But other than that, don't tell me what to do." So,
Yeah.
and that's the way, and that's that relationship with the Scotland Grand Lodge still continues to this day. Obviously, much more friendlier over the past 300 years, but still, it's much more of a come back with a warrant type of masonry instead of a compliance type masonry.
Well, you got to remember also that, this whole Grand Lodge system it's not been there since time immemorial, right? So, a governing body for each, at least here in the country, there were lodges here before there were Grand Lodges, right? Those lodges were the ones that created their own Grand Lodges when they decided to, leave that monarchy that we love so much.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. But yeah, remember, it's a relatively newer concept in the whole speculative Freemasonry idea, and but it's one that's worked for, to Juan's point, for several centuries. So it's really easy to poo-poo the process, but you start to realize that that process is there for a reason, and it's running a rather large organization,
Right.
which is not easy to do,
And that's
one that does
true.
not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true for all large organizations. They're going to be bureaucratic by design, right? To make sure that there is a rationale, a process, checks and balance behind change, right? Because the bigger you are, whether you're McDonald's, whether you're Ford or whether you're a Grand Lodge, like you don't want change to happen quickly, lest you lose some amount of control. That's a good point.
Yeah, you don't want the local franchise owners selling powdered milkshake. You don't want that.
Yeah, you should watch The
You see what I
Founder.
did there?
Ah, good movie.
Great
Yeah.
movie.
That's a great example there.
Yeah, no, I
Now
like
we
it.
gotta do a McDonald's and Masonry or Mac Masonry, and then like find all the parallels of Masonry and McDonald's.
I'm game.
Sign me
I
up.
got Joe excited. All right.
I'm sorry.
All right. So, final question for tonight. This one can be as broad or as specific as you like. Favorite Masonic law. So you're gonna have to go sit back and think through either how Masonry is structured, or some weird obscure law, or some law that maybe you think should be changed. I'll even add that in there. So I'll start. I'll be generous so to get your neurons fired up here. Here in Virginia, we're still in 2021 a dry masonry where you cannot have alcohol on neither the lodge premise but also the premise of the parking lot as well. So that was a looks like a good drink you just had there, Joe. And so, given that we have a warden whose job it is to make sure that we don't lead any of our brethren to intemperance or excess, and that we, are responsible adults, that I think that it should be something that could be reevaluated in future times. So that would be my law that is not my favorite, but one that I think should be up for reevaluation. So let's head over to Joe.
Well, the answer to that is just go to your local shrine temple. And that fixes that. So I would say my law, or I guess I'll be going back to a landmark. No atheist can be made a Mason. I dig that one. I think it gives us a great baseline for universality. And I know some jurisdictions that we don't recognize have changed that. Probably for the worse, right? Because I think that's the one big common thread that we can all tie to, no matter where or who we pray to. So for me, that's one that's a deal breaker. That one should stay. And yeah, drinking in lodges, like John said.
Cool. Right, the brotherhood of men under the fatherhood of God. All right, Juan, what's your answer?
For me, I do have a special place in my heart for Masonic funerals. The idea that a man joins the fraternity and gets entrusted with these beautiful teachings, and at the moment of his departure, all the brothers come together and not only pay their respect, but have a very unique way of showing the friends and family of the deceased what made his journey as a Mason special. And the fact that that is part of the fabric of our organization, I think it's beautiful. So that has to be one of my favorite, and I do enjoy hearing the discussions, which is why I brought up earlier whether an inner apprentice should get a Masonic funeral. And I love hearing those discussions because people bring very passionate and oftentimes valid points for and against presenting a Masonic funeral to an entered apprentice. So anyway, that would be my favorite. But it's funny that, John, right off the bat, you led with the drinking in lodge or having alcoholic beverage, because that's the first thing that came to mind in Florida. And I wasn't going to say it because it's not my favorite. It's my least favorite.
Right.
It's like, I'm a grown man, and if you teach me that I need to be temperate, and then you don't trust me with exercising the application of that lesson, then
Bingo.
What's going on? Like, can you not trust me?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, thank you all for watching and for listening. And I invite you to go head over to thegentleman'sbrotherhood.com, where you can see some of the work that I do to help men in their improvement in the various aspects of their life. So, gentleman'sbrotherhood.com. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, Juan. All right, so yeah, this has been fun to really think about. Why do we have this concept of jurisprudence? How do we manage our laws, our rules, our edicts, our bylaws, and so on and so forth? And it's been tradition, right? It's a tradition that has kept us stable for over 300 years. But with that comes a lot of checks and balances, and that's a good thing in today's society. So if you're interested in more, head on over to your local Grand Lodge and go check out their Committee on Jurisprudence, or dig into their constitutions, their Methodical Digest, or their Ahiman Raison, and you'll learn more about how they operate, what makes them tick, and how to make those resolutions to change the future of Masonry. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.